Thanks so much, everyone, for watching. We've got an epic lineup tonight of speakers. We've got an awesome panel here. Amazing group of functional doctors, technology, activists for a leap forward in medicine.
You know, our goal is to make it easy for practitioners to learn in community.
This ecosystem that is being set up by the meetup groups, we believe will be the future ecosystem of this evolved primary care network, and it all revolves around you.
Welcome to the Functional Forum. Thanks for joining us in the charge to accelerate the evolution of medicine. Please welcome your host, James Maskell.
Hello everyone, welcome to the Functional Forum. Glad to have you all here tonight. Excited for tonight's episode, the Reinvention of Mental Health. Here I am, and we're going to have a great show for you this evening. We've got some very exciting interviews coming up, but we also have two incredible speakers here live with us on the session. We've got the godfather of functional medicine, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, also the founder of the Personalized Lifestyle Medicine Institute. We're going to be talking more about one of their upcoming conferences soon. And we also have Dr. Helen Messier, who is one of the leading lights on the sort of front lines of genomics, the microbiome, and functional medicine too. So tonight we're excited to be talking about the reinvention of mental health. This is a three-part series. Tonight we're going to be talking about the sort of gut immune interface as this sort of new era of mental health that's that's based on systems biology and includes the gut and the immune system and the brain. And then next month we're going to be talking doing a deep dive on depression, and then the month after that in September we're going to be talking about addiction, all areas where functional medicine can be a significant force in this reinvention of medicine. Tonight we're also going to be sharing that we have updated our resources. So if you go to goevomed.com/resources, you'll see this growing, emerging network of companies and organizations that are supporting organizations to start to facilitate this reinvention of medicine. And so I'm super grateful for them. And we're going to be talking about a couple of them that particularly have reference to this reinvention of mental health. So before we get Dr. Bland and Dr. Messier here on the video, I want to start by sharing an interview that I did last week with Dr. Emeran Mayer. He is a leading gastroenterologist, and he has written a recent book called The Gut Immune Connection that's excellent, but he wrote a previous book called The Gut-Mind Connection. So I want to start with just 10 minutes of an interview that I did with Dr. Mayer, and you'll see lots of interesting starting points for this reinvention of mental health. Enjoy. So a warm welcome to the show, Dr. Emeran Mayer. Welcome, Doc.
Thanks for having me in the show, Jim. Looking forward to our conversation.
We're very excited to connect with you and to kick off our three-part series that we're doing this summer on the reinvention of mental health. And I first heard about your work through the gut-mind connection and your work on as a gastroenterologist talking about mental health. And could there be any more interesting starting point from the reinvention of mental health than starting with a gastroenterologist? So, what started you on the journey to think about mental health, and what did you learn along the way?
So my interest in mental health and the mind really goes back to college. I'm an avid reader of Freud and Jung at the time, decided when I decided to go to medical school, I always had in the back of my mind I would choose psychiatry, which then in the practical world was not exactly what I had in mind. But I noticed early on, even as a resident, that patients with gastrointestinal disorders almost always had a mind component to their disease. So that made me decide, gastroenterology is the right specialty for me. And so this interest has continued, and I've spent pretty much my entire career on studying these interactions between the brain and the gut at multiple levels, from isolated cells to animal models, The last 10 years really focusing on humans, because I do believe to really understand these interactions, you have to go to the complexity of the human brain. We can't really see the types of things in the mouse or in other animal models. So,
yeah, that's super interesting. So, in this reinvention of mental health, what role do you see the gut playing in modulating, and how do you compare its ability to modulate to sort of more traditional behavioral health tactics?
Yeah, so this is kind of interesting. It was very clear to me from the beginning of my career that there are these connections, that top down, that any emotion, particularly we studied negative emotions, anger, fear, anxiety, stress, would have an effect on the gut. Many patients, if you ask them that, will tell you that as well. So this could range from the butterflies, feeling butterflies in your stomach when you're aroused about a negative or positive situation, to the knots in the stomach, to the cramps in your lower abdomen. I sort of came up with this concept that just like our face expresses emotions, if you're good in reading people's faces, you will always know if this person is angry or anxious or upset. Something like that, probably in a much more sophisticated way, happens in the gut. Most people don't feel it, or obviously we can't see it, but you have to imagine that anytime you have an emotion, there will be a mirror image in the gut, with all its consequences on contractions, peristalsis, transit, fluid secretion, blood flow. Virtually every function of the gut is influenced by these top-down influences. And then the bottom-up influences. Noticed early on that in patients with, for example, irritable bowel syndrome, they have a greater sensitivity to events that go on in the gut. And with events, I mean anything going in the gut, food, chemicals, medications, but also contractions and distensions, and distension by food intake or by the gas production will be perceived more and will create more discomfort and anxiety for example, in patients with irritable bowel syndrome. I personally believe that that's the main mechanism why people have their IBS symptoms. So this increased transmission or amplification of gut information to the brain. And then there's this whole issue about that almost all patients with irritable bowel syndrome also have an elevated level of anxiety. They may not have clinical anxiety, but if you do, questionnaire assessment, 95% will have an increased level of anxiety. And this sort of speaks to this close interaction. You could almost say that anxiety is the mental part of a more sensitive gut. And that was the easiest of these connections. There's also a connection between depression and gut. So constipation is a lot more common in patients with depression, and improvement of the constipation will lead to often to improvement of depression symptoms and vice versa. So this was sort of the early indications and the very obvious indications that there's this connection. What we're doing now and what we're looking at now goes actually much further with other brain disorders, going beyond depression and anxiety, going to Alzheimer's disease and cognitive function and Parkinson's. So there's a whole range of these other diseases that are now linked to gut health.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I can say that someone who has a 4-month-old right now, that it's pretty obvious to see, their mental state and their digestive state so easily linked and so obvious. And this being my second child, I think the first child I was busy and not really like as present as I am this time. And so I can really, see and feel it. And you see how important the digestive health is to their mood. I'm really interested on the sort of bi-directionality that you've described, because it feels like a lot of times in functional medicine as well, we're thinking about this mind and how mental health is affected by what's going on in the gut and the microbiome, and we're going to have a lot more conversation on that. But you were pointing to earlier this sort of other direction, right, where things that happen in the mind are then having an impact on the digestion. How difficult is it to sort of clinic? What do you lean on clinically working with patients to try and like tease those two things apart?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's always a detailed history taking. This is not something that you can sort of get a good impression with the modern way of 10 minutes per new patient. You really have to get often into some personal psychological. I would say that, and maybe this is a self-selection of the patients that come to see me. Many of them have read my book, The Mind-Gut Connection, and come with the book and say, I'm patient so-and-so in your book, which is interesting. So finding out or quickly getting to the core of this. So I'm not the psychiatrist, I'm not and the psychologist, I'm not going through an hour of just exploring psychological problems, but some of the core issues, what is going on currently, and it's not as simple as, are you stressed? Well, everybody is stressed. Obviously, that is not a good, but are there any things that have changed recently that, good or bad? Also, a very important thing is what happened early on in life. So, always ask this question, did you have a happy childhood? And it's remarkable, for a non-psychiatrist, how much information I get in response to that question. And that gets to this whole issue of early adversity being a risk factor for anxiety and for, many of these gut disorders. And it is quite common. I mean, it's not sexual abuse. It's, illness of the primary caregiver, or divorce to the parents, or verbal abuse, or anything that sort of compromises the harmony, within the family environment early on. So with those two questions, I get a snapshot. Is this person vulnerable for more anxiety, for more, of different gut issues? Then that sort of forms some basis of like therapeutic interventions that I would say that most of my patients, I offer sort of a three-angled approach, like a holistic approach. One is always diet. Another one is what I call mind-targeted therapies. And that could range from just simple relaxation exercises to abdominal breathing, to short-term cognitive behavioral therapy, which now is becoming available online, so it's much easier to administer. In addition to medications in some patients. So if I get somebody with severe anxiety or comorbid depression, I will also add an antidepressant to this treatment. Or, more often a very low dose of these tricyclic antidepressants that don't really act as antidepressants, but it seems they're stabilizing in some ways that we don't know exactly how, these brain-gut interactions. So, I'm definitely somebody who stays away from medication as much as possible, but, with the severe kind of patients that I often see at a tertiary referral practice, that's often unavoidable.
All right, good stuff there from Dr. Emeran Mayer. And if you like Dr. Mayer, there's a lot more that you'll hear from him at an upcoming conference in October, the plmi Microbiome 2.0 Symposium. Dr. Bland, Dr. Mayer, and Dr. Helen Messier will be three of the main speakers, but there's also some other people that I'm excited to hear, like Dr. Elroy Vojdani and Dr. Phyllis Z. So you can find out more about it in the show notes here today. I've got an update of it's October 15th and 16th. This is a conference that we've been to before, Mastering the Implementation of Personalized Lifestyle Medicine. And so we're grateful to have some of the heavy hitters here this evening. Now, Dr. Bland, I want to ask you a question. Dr. Mayer is not a functional medicine doctor. How many times in your career have you seen this pathway? 1, Doctor thinks about writing a book. 2, Doctor dives into the latest literature on their specialty. Part 3, Doctor realizes they were a functional medicine doctor all along and didn't know it. and how well do you think Dr. Mayer fits into that, that trifecta that we just saw?
Well, I like to think, James, that all of us are connected into a universal truth. And, we have different paths to get to truth, and truth is not a linear path, it's circuitous. But there are some fundamental principles that we are learning about the human body and how it functions. And when you get closer to truth, they all tend to connect together, no matter what discipline you came from.
Yeah, that's great. Dr. Messier, there's a couple of things that he said in there, that anxiety was he often saw was like a sensitive gut, and depression connected to constipation. Are these things, I know you're actually seeing patients, every day there in Silicon Valley. Are these things that you've noticed along your path as well?
Yeah, absolutely. I was kind of nodding. I didn't have the video on, but I was absolutely nodding with everything he said. He's so right. And I actually wanted to go into psychiatry too back in med school, which is kind of funny. I was laughing at that. But I actually have a very personal experience about this gut-brain connection. So a number of years ago, I was diagnosed with C. diff, right? The classic C. diff colitis. I have never been more sick in my life. But the biggest thing was a profound depression, right? I'm a happy-go-lucky, relatively person most of the time. But at that point in time with that C. diff infection, I was so depressed, and there was nothing I could do to get out of it until that C. diff. And once we treated the C. diff, the depression magically went away. So there's just this powerful connection with the gut brain in that sense, and I do see this in my patients all the time. That connection with, definitely irritable bowel syndrome and sort of the mind controlling the gut, right? The butterflies in the stomach, as Dr. Mayer said, but the other way, also how the gut then controls the mind, I think is really what we're learning more and more about now.
Absolutely. Well, Dr. Bland, I'd love to just, maybe start with some synthesis from you on this topic, because ultimately, the conference that's coming up and what we're going to be talking about here today is this sort of like gut immune interface and how we treat it. But this topic is on this reinvention of mental health. And I thought it was a good starting point, because just in those examples, we see that there are other things playing into mental health that haven't really been considered historically. And, it wasn't that long ago that we found out that there was an immune system in the brain and, these kind of things. So at the sort of the highest possible level, this reinvention of mental health, what does the immune system and the gut and the microbiome have to do? And how are these things intertwined? And where do you see as the sort of leverage point for this reinvention of mental health?
Well, James, this is really a fascinating story that connects, it's like a detective story that connects to starfish and sea urchin on the French shore. And the individual who, in the late 19th century, took over for the aging and soon to expire Louis Pasteur at the Pasteur Institute. And I was speaking about the individual who was a Russian physiologist, Ili Mechnikov, who on the French shore did a little observation with his monocle in which he picked up a sea urchin with its spiny crust, and he punctured the surface of a starfish. And he watched on the surface with that little low power magnification what he thought were these, of course, this is the age of microbiology, right? So they were just discovering bacteria in the microscope, Leeuwenhoek, and being able to look at the smaller world, the microscopic world. And so he saw these, what looked like bacteria, coming to the site where he punctured the starfish with the sea urchin quill. And it got him very interested, thinking, how could these bacteria be living inside the starfish? And of course, they weren't bacteria at all. They were phagocytic cells, which are the innate immune system. And that then set him on to a path that eventually had him write a book after he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine and Physiology in 1901 for discovering the innate immune system. He wrote a book called The Prolongation of Life. And in that book, which was translated into English in 1902, he described his clinical observations of patients who had various degrees of mental illness and what we call, I guess, mental dysfunction, associated with what we later call gut endobiosis, bacterial problems in the gut, which he found the remediation was to give them Lactobacillus bulgaricus, which was yogurt, and instill yogurt by enema. And the prolongation of life was the use of altering their gut microbial concentration by giving them this installation by enema of this bacteria. And it influenced in somehow their immune systems. So this goes full circle to the starfish and the sea urchin. And from that then was born at the beginning of the 20th century, this concept that maybe some problems ranging from schizophrenia to hallucinations to mania was associated with something going on in the gut and the gut immune system. And this is well before the brain had been discovered to have its own immune system called the microglia, or even that the gut was found to have its gastrointestinal associated lymphoid tissue, the immune system of the gut. So this was an observation based on certain principles that came with the tools that were available at the turn of the century, or the last century. Now that concept was so powerful as it got picked up and tried, that it became actually the dominant theme in American psychiatric medicine in the 1920s. The most preeminent psychiatrist in America was a gentleman by the name of Henry Cotton. Henry Cotton was the head of the Trenton State Hospital, the largest mental hospital in the United States, 3,400 beds in New Jersey. And Cotton was so convinced that the Metchnikoff hypothesis was correct, that these range of these mental illnesses could be connected to a gut immune function, that he did everything he could to alter gut function. The problem was the concept was right, but the treatment that he chose was wrong. He was a megalomaniac. And what they did is by surgery in the psychiatric hospital, they surgically removed all immune tissue from the gut, tonsils, shortened the bowel, took out the appendix, such that people ended up with extraordinary surgical, post-surgical problems. He then kept reporting to the government all these magnificent positive outcomes. At the National Institutes of Health and various meetings, he was presenting these positive outcomes of his treatments. Only about 10 years later, a whistleblower, one of his students, came clean and said that the data had been all manipulated and that actually there were hundreds of deaths and people had been buried in strange places. And so when they did a full exposition on this work, they found out that lo and behold, he had been falsifying the data. They had been taking teeth out of people, taking all these surgeries and various things under not controlled circumstances. And so what happened in the 1930s in the United States was that rather than taking, criticizing Cotton for absolute malfeasance in clinical practice and human experimentation, they jumped on the concept that there was no such thing as auto-intoxication, and the concept was wrong. And so it was completely purged from American medical literature and American teaching. And in fact, if you were to have raised the concept that the gut had something to do with mental illness in any responsible medical center in the United States from 1940 till about 1990, you would have been purged, you would have been defrocked, you would have been delicensed, you could have even been jailed. And it was considered totally a crank concept. In the middle 80s, in fact, I found my notes, I couldn't believe it, 1985, we started giving lectures on endotoxemia. And kind of to my naivete at the point, because I didn't know about Henry Cotton, I didn't know about all this history that had pre-existed, I started talking to doctors about what we had learned in the later years, in the 1970s and 80s, about the gut immune system and about gut microbial metabolism and influence that it had on immune cells, and the fact that the gut was the principal site where serotonin was produced, serotonin being a neuroactive chemical, and about 2/3 of the body's serotonin is produced in the gut by the gut enterochromaffin cells. And all of this at the time in 1985 was kind of considered by people that were coming to my seminars fairly new. I mean, kind of maybe even revolutionary new. But it was really just built upon this history that went way back to Metchnikoff, the starfish and the sea urchin, and then the advancing of that concept through different fields that were disconnected. They weren't connected to medicine. They were basic science fields of immunology and gastrointestinal physiology and hepatology and neurology. And if you went and you looked at the individual segments of science, you would see that they all were coming up with a central theme that overlapped to create a new way of thinking about what had been the Metchnikoff theory of the turn of the century, the last century. And I learned something really powerful during this period. This would have been like the middle 80s for me. I was introduced to what I think was one of the most brilliant psychiatrists, thinkers that I had ever been exposed to. And his work revolutionized the field, Abram Hoffer. Abram Hoffer was a psychiatrist trained in Canada, but before he had become a psychiatrist, he was a farm boy in Manitoba, Saskatchewan. He was very interested in agriculture and the chemistry of growing plants. So he got a PhD in organic chemistry in the early 1930s, which kind of gave him some interesting insight into molecules and how they influence function. He then became very interested in psychiatry and went back and got a psychiatric medical degree. So he was an MD PhD studying molecules that influenced brain behavior. He and his partner, Humphrey Osmond, were two of the first people to study psychedelics and their effect on neuropsychiatric disorders. He also, because of his work with chemistry in agriculture, got very interested in a common mental disorder, schizophrenia, whose principal reporting symptoms are the 3 Ds of dermatitis, diarrhea, and dementia. And it was known that this condition, pellagra, was caused by a deficiency of one of the vitamins, B3 niacin, which had been discovered by the Goldbergers, a husband and wife team, public health service physicians in the 1930s. So Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer decided that maybe they should look at whether there's any nutritional connection to mental illness and schizophrenia. And they started looking at brain biochemicals that were associated with people that were niacin deficient, and found that in their blood they could identify this chemical that was a byproduct of poor metabolism of the amino acid tryptophan, that was a brain neuroactive chemical that in animal models could produce a condition that would resemble schizophrenia in humans. And so they started to piece together this model of why certain psychedelic chemicals could modulate brain function to change the sense of reality, change the sense of introspection. This is well before we got into, the more later understanding of brain biochemistry. But all this tied together to give rise to a new emergent view of where certain aspects of mental illness could arise that were not just from Freudian bad experiences. And he was heavily criticized because his era was the era of Freudian psychiatry for looking at the brain as a biochemical factory and its interconnection to the rest of the body, like the gut's immune system. Now, to close out my story, it's a long-winded kind of story, but let me just close it out by saying that as things have evolved and people have started to understand more, we recognize that Henry Cotton, although he was a crazy guy and a megalomaniac, the construct that there were people that were being put in mental hospitals as a consequence of brain biochemical alterations due to gut dysbiosis and gut alteration was not completely unfounded. And in fact, if you go back and look at the people in Southern Appalachia of America that would get in the fall the dementia associated with pellagra, these were normally immigrants from Eastern Europe who were on poor quality diets. They were of poverty many times, and they would go into mental hospitals. And it was thought during this period of time that it was because of their genetic structure. This was the era of eugenics. And it was felt that they were poor genetic structure, immigrants coming from Europe, and they were constrained to get this mental illness because of their genes, not as a consequence, as the Goldbergers found out and Hoffer and Osmond proved, because they were in a diet deprived of a nutrient necessary to make the brain function correctly. So all of these things are now starting to emerge in 21st century psychiatry under a field that's called biological psychiatry, which is tying together the immune system with gut function, with brain chemistry, and revolutionizing, I believe, how people see the states of mental illness and what to do with it.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. I think it gives so much context for it. And yeah, it's very interesting to learn about all the characters involved and you know, this sort of wild journey that the truth goes through to be discovered, right? So from one Canadian polymath to another, here we got, you know, Helen Messier. Helen, you know, you're like the ways that we might measure the microbiome is very interesting, right? Because now we have abilities to measure it. And I know you're going to be talking about this at the PLMI conference in October, but you've been involved with a couple of projects where measuring the microbiome is now possible, you know, for the first time, and really understanding in sort of numbers what's happening down there, giving us a whole new level of specificity. So what can you tell us about what's happening in that world, and where, if in this reinvention of mental health, how we might be able to measure some of these core modulating functions?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. And, you know, it's evolving. Our whole understanding and I think acceptance of the role of the microbiome in overall health has really started with our ability to sequence it. Until then, it was just this big black tube that we really couldn't see into. And so, you know, our ability to first we culture what comes out of the stool. Now, all of this is based on what's coming out of the stool. Okay, so that's, I think, still a limitation of our ability to actually understand what's going on in the microbiome, because I've really come to understand that, you know, just like real estate, the microbiome is location, 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 right? What's going on where? Is it happening up in the small intestine where we have organisms that may be absolutely fine if they're growing down in the colon, but now we have a SIBO type picture because of the much more sensitive environment in the upper intestine? Do we have organisms at that mucosal interface doing something versus in kind of the cecum in the center that may have, studies have shown that they're very different. So we always have to understand, first of all, what we're measuring, right? We're measuring what's coming out in the stool. And even then we can still get a lot of really good information, and our understanding of the microbiome has just exploded with our ability, like I said, to sequence it. First of all, using, sequencing using PCR probes, the 16S ribosomal gene, and then doing whole genome sequencing. We can even sequence RNA. So we do have to understand where it's coming from. So there's a lot of caveats that come with that. Like I said, you have to understand what you're sequencing, and we're starting to see all these associations of certain types of bacteria with certain diseases. For example, Akkermansia, oh, that's a good guy, isn't it? Right? Well, it's good for diabetes, right? It helps with sugar regulation. But we know that in MS and in Parkinson's models, they have higher levels of Akkermansia associated with those diseases. So, is that good or is that bad, right? We're still really learning context matters, right? We have to, all of our kind of sequencing up until now has been point in time. we have to really, Jeff, I gave a talk, I don't know how many years ago it was now, on the circadian rhythm of the microbiome, right? How our microbiome changes on a daily basis, and it changes on a yearly basis. It changes with what we eat. It changes with how much sleep we got the night before. It changes with whether we're under stress. So measuring the longitudinal changes is going to be really important, and because it's very unique for every person. And there was a brand new study this morning, actually, that I read that just came out last week on looking at the heritability of the microbiome. And they looked at baboons. So they've been studying this baboon colony in East Africa since 1971. And, I can imagine those little researchers or grad students running out and collecting poop from all of these baboons. But basically they've monitored about 585 individual baboons, and they've longitudinally checked their microbiome samples. And they know, the family dynamics and the heritability of all of the whole tribe of baboons, and they've shown that 97% of the microbiome phenotypes are heritable. And that heritability changes definitely based on what they eat. So it shows up more in the dry season when there's a less diverse diet. It shows up more as they age. So it makes you wonder if there's sort of a core microbiome that we inherit from, that we inherit as we go, or that our genetics is more amenable to. So there's a lot of really fun things that are coming out right now. And the power of collecting this big data. I was listening to a wonderful talk by the Bio Collective, then looking at Parkinson's disease. We know that Parkinson's is very much associated with microbiome, right? One of the very first signs of Parkinson's disease is constipation. So we've looked at that, and there's a little bit, we mentioned the Akkermansia, some associations with composition, but it's not until you look at the patterns, right? This many organisms are higher and this many are lower, and also looking at the genetic patterns. What genes do these organisms have? Turns out that glycosylation genes are really important in Parkinson's disease. So you need to, as we start to be able to look at the patterns, we're going to see get much more information, rather than, is it this one organism? Is it this one thing?
Yeah. As you were saying that, I was wondering about this idea. So, we've been taking glucose readings, and they were kind of interesting, but not nearly as interesting as a continuous glucose monitor, right?
Exactly.
So I kind of hear what you're saying is that maybe where the potential of the microbiome is like a continuous microbiome monitor, where you're able to see patterns and how patterns change and how that changes with the environment. Because I know so many people who have worn the continuous glucose monitor have learned so much about their own unique adaptation to stress or otherwise. And Jeff and I have done a number of podcasts on this exact topic. Do you think that that's, it's obviously a little bit further in the future because there's so much to measure, but seems like that's maybe where kind of it's heading?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I completely agree with that. Just wearing the glucose monitor. I heard Jeff talk in a webinar this morning where he was mentioning his highest morning glucose is first thing, highest glucose is first thing in the morning when you get that cortisol response, right? Well, now typically we measure first morning blood sugar to determine if you have diabetes. Like, you may be labeled diabetic if you didn't understand where it fits in the variation. So it's absolutely true. We have to, people are working on these pills to swallow to measure the microbiome as you go through. And there's lots of really very exciting, ingenious kind of methods that we're developing to measure the microbiome. So I think that's coming. We don't have that right now in clinical practice. So the best thing to do is understand what you're looking at, understand the context, right? What did the person eat the night before they measured that microbiome, right? Yeah. Did they sleep well? Were they under stress? We know that stress can cause more inflammatory organisms to grow, right? So it's really, and looking into the mechanisms of that is just really amazing. We can get into if we have time, but so understanding what you have in the context, it means you can still use it today, but understand the caveats and context around it.
Jeff, that reminds me of Big Bold Health season 1, episode 3 or something, or episode 1, when I think you were talking about those things as well. I know you did. It was great to see Lee Hood at the IFM conference. I remember you were part of that Pioneer 100, right? That's probably the closest thing that anyone's had to what we're talking about, right? A dynamic measurement of microbiome. Were there things that you learned about yourself through that journey that you think hold promise to what Helen's talking about here?
Yeah, I think that that study, that Pioneer 100 study, was kind of the first voyage into this new biometric universe, right? Of complex data sets where people were measuring their symptoms as well as their physiology using different kinds of evaluations, and then also having a full genome screen done, and trying to piece all that information together with some type of an algorithm that could make connections. I think that for us, probably in that initial study, depending on how familiar you were with those variables, because I think we had, each one of us, several million data points that we had measured over the course of 3 years. Mm-hmm. If you were familiar with some of those variables, you could start to see how your patterns could align to different things going on in your life. If you were less familiar with those, it would maybe be totally overwhelming, because there was just so much information, and it was almost like drinking out of a fire hose. So I believe that part of what Helen is speaking to is not only information in and of itself, but the ability to interpolate it and to analyze it to come to pattern recognition that is actionable. Yeah. And that you then know exactly, okay, this tells you something about yourself that you can then do something about that would really make a meaningful difference in how you look, act, and feel. And I think that first study was more a fact-finding journey than it was delivering all sorts of executional information, mm-hmm. because I think you have to have the baseline set up before you can really start to do the analysis of what you do. And I think that we're getting there. I look at what's going on with Michael Schneider's group at Stanford. They've really extended a lot of what Lee Hood was initially doing. There are a number of, the All of Us studies that are now going on with the NIH. I think there's over 300,000 people now whose data have been captured by their volunteering, their genetic and phenotypic information into this large database. Yeah. So we're getting more granular information that will come out of this, and artificial intelligence and pattern recognition type software and machine learning will help us to better interpolate it. I think ultimately what's going to happen is, through fairly simple monitoring devices that you may wear on your body someplace, information will be 24/7 available that will come back in real time and tell you during the day, hey, you kind of strayed off. Whatever you did, you need to kind of recorrect. Yeah. And you'll have information to make real-time decisions about how you're traveling in your life and what decisions you're making about how, because we all know there's not just one diet or one lifestyle to enlightenment. There's a lot of individuality from person.
Yeah, and no one diet for any one person at all points in their life, right? It changes based on where you are in your life as well, I think. Yeah.
In fact, James, I was, while Helen was talking, she reminded me of Robert Sapolsky, why zebras don't get ulcers, the stress researcher at Stanford. And he most recently has been involved with actually connecting his work, and again, it's on baboons in Africa. He recently was a co-author of a paper, I try to remember the title. It's called Depression's Unlikely Trinity: Dysregulated Stress, Immunity, and the Microbiome. Yeah. So you can kind of see the direction that this whole field is taking. So here's a person that's a stress physiologist who is now working on microbiome and its connection to dysregulated stress and immunity.
Yeah, that's fascinating. I've sort of delved a little bit, like, why does stress actually cause certain harmful bacteria to grow more? If you think about it, if you take these bacteria, microorganisms are absolutely amazing, and they adapt very readily to a different environment, right? You take anthrax, right? And you stick it in the soil, and it's not very great for it to grow, and it'll sporulate, and it'll sit there for years until you move it to a different environment, like it enters your skin now, and suddenly it senses that different environment. It completely changes its whole genetic transcriptional profile and starts producing all these virulence genes and toxin genes that then, kill the host eventually, actually fairly quickly. So, and that same bacteria can be completely benign and a killer just based on a different environment. And I think that same thing happens in our gut, right? We know that with C. diff, everybody has C. diff, at least from almost all of the samples that I've looked at. I've very rarely find someone without C. diff, but it's not causing problems, as everybody knows. It's until you change the environment with antibiotics. And I think the same thing happens with a lot of these organisms with stress. They actually have cortisol sensors on them, and they sense when the host is stressed, meaning, wow, that might be a better time to start growing. When the host is under stress, I probably have a better chance of surviving and bypassing the immune system, because the stress will suppress the immune response. So it's just this amazing kind of adaptation that these organisms have developed, both to benefit us and not to benefit us.
Yeah, super interesting. Well, so I think clinically you can see that we're on a starting point here for a, microbiome aware, systems biology, lifestyle first, root cause approach to the future of mental health. And I think we're all aligned on that. And obviously, if you want to really dive into a lot more on that, there's conferences and other things, and we're getting through it. I just wanted to share one other area of the reinvention and get your thoughts on it, because Jeff, you mentioned earlier, okay, what did mental health look like in the 1930s? Send them to the mental institution, right? And then it was like, oh, there's a friendly psychiatrist in the hospital. There's a wing of the hospital dedicated to psychiatry. Then there's like a very nice private practice psychiatrist where you can go and lay on a couch, right? And now you see the majority of mental health now is probably going to be delivered virtually. And I just saw actually a stat today that telemedicine is at 38x its pre-COVID levels. It's multiplied by 38 times. And so I was interested in that, not because I think it's interesting, that journey anyway, but I think it's interesting in the fact that, what the medicine that we're talking about here is profoundly an environmental medicine of one environment and another, the stress environment, the food environment, the toxin environment, otherwise that's what functional medicine is. And here now we have psychiatry or mental health delivery being delivered to patients in their actual environment, at home, where they live most of their life and all of their life if it happens to be in lockdown. And I was just wanting to get your thoughts on, what benefits there can be for clinicians to actually be treating people in the environment that they live, and, giving certain clues as to, some of the triggers, mediators, that might be, driving, and antecedents that might be driving, pathophysiology mentally.
Helen?
Did you want me to go with that? Yeah.
No.
I mean, I think it's a huge opportunity, right? There are definitely drawbacks. You don't have that sort of face to face where you can see all of their body language, right? We sort of see from here up and things like that. But it also gives you a view into their home environment, as you said, right? You can see when their kids jump on them and bug them. You can see, sort of what their environment looks like. You can see sort of more who they are, right? Because when they come into the office, and this is a great example, we were doing a sort of a chronic fatigue study, and we wanted to get all of these biomarkers at times when people have crashes, right? But when do they come in to see the doctor? They don't come in when they're crashed and they can't get out of bed. They're not going to come to see you. They only come in when they're feeling well. So if that's the only time you see them, you don't get a really good sense of what's really going on. So I think that telemedicine gives us that opportunity to really see people at all times and really peer into their environment a little more and really be able to put context around who they are and context around their illness.
Jeff, what do you think about that?
Well, I think that's really a brilliant insight, Helen. I hadn't actually thought about that. That certainly makes very good sense. I'll have to look at some of the studies on that. I'm sure that that's been done. That's really
Yeah, the flares, right? Yeah.
But I also think that another context is accessibility.
Yeah.
Because we know that one of the barriers for medically underserved is just accessibility, and as simple as transportation, or I mean, it could be many different variables that prohibit you having access beyond that of the economics of the visit itself. So I think if we were to democratize the availability of healthcare, just like democratizing the availability of good education, then this model of being more virtual will open it up to more people. Maybe the individuals will be get slightly less successful treatment on an individual basis, but collectively we'll get more impact on more people. So the some integrated effect should be positive on society.
Yeah.
There are so many people in need that don't have access based on the structure of the system today to service.
Yeah, very true.
And certainly if you could provide that then a group foundational structure, one, a little bit of value to one adds actually value to all the other nodes in the ecosystem. And therefore you get this structural transformation inside that container, which is really powerful too. Well, look, I wanted to spend a bit of time here doing we got about just 10 minutes left. So I just want to throw a few hot button terms at you, which, I actually crowdsourced from our community a few terms that they thought was, synonymous with the reinvention of mental health. So as quickly as possible, I'd love to get each of you to dive in on these, and I'll just bring it up on the screen here so that you can see it. So these are just sort of five topics that relate to this conversation about mental health. So the first, and I think we jumped into a little bit, but adherence. Jeff, you were on a webinar today, I know, with Fullscript, and their whole rollout with their total adherence conversation that they've been leading here for the last couple of months. I'd love to hear from both of you just briefly on the role that you see adherence playing in this reinvention of mental health.
Well, let me just do a quick 30 seconds. Adherence really relates to ability of a person to self-elect, to participate, and to self-regulate, versus compliance, which is top-down command and control. You will do what I say. And in terms of long-term behavior changes that lead to substantive change in outcome, there's never been any support for compliance as being a way that works. Compliance may work in short-term crisis care, but in long-term behavioral management systems, compliance-based systems don't work. Adherence, which affiliates self-elected participation on the part of the person that has to make the change through teamsmanship, is the only thing that's ever been proven to work. So I think adherence is the magic sauce to make lifestyle behavior change work.
All right. Well, that was so good. We're going to zip on to the next
We're
one.
skipping it? Okay.
I'm going to skip you, Helen, because I know you love this next one. What about trauma in care?
Oh, yes.
The future mental health.
I mean, I think recently, thank goodness, we're really starting to recognize the impact of trauma on not just mental health, but all aspects of health, physical, mental. We can't really separate the two. As we've shown, the gut and the brain are connected. And it's really interesting. You start to tease out, we know that adverse childhood experiences, right, and I think Dr. Mayer was talking about that too, have a profound effect on what kind of, not just anxiety, depression, and mental health, but physical diseases that you get in the future, because we know how stress impacts things. And it comes down to even more. There's started doing a bit of a dive into trauma and really looking at just a great example, BDNF. We all know brain-derived neurotrophic factor. We know how important it is for brain development, for memory making, for just being able to think clearly. Well, there's been study after study to show that childhood trauma actually hypermethylates BDNF in the brain, so you get much less expression of it. And they actually did the study in rats. They've shown this in humans as well, but in rats, they did one where they socially isolated the rats, which is very traumatic for the rats. They're very social creatures like humans are. And they measured the BDNF, very hypermethylated, very low expression of BDNF and protein expression. And then they socially re-engage them, right? They re-socialize them, so to speak, put them back in with their litter mates and their family. And the good news is that BDNF hypermethylation actually reversed, and they were able to express more. So the good news is that, yes, trauma has a huge effect on so many aspects. And I know this is a quick fire, so we don't have time to go into all of them, but that when you treat that, even if it's just re-socialization, you actually can reverse those physical effects. And so I think that gives us a lot of hope that we really should be asking about and addressing trauma. I think Dr. Mayer mentioned that as well, that if you ask about it, it's there in not almost every single patient that I see. They have some type of illness. There's some type of trauma that's happened to them, emotional dysregulation that needs to be addressed if we're going to achieve real wellness.
One of the things that I see, especially for clinicians who have been in functional medicine a while, and especially female clinicians, when they first start out, it's very much like in the details of the labs with patients. And then as they do it for a few years, it's like, ooh, let's zoom out. How are you doing? You know, like, tell me about what's going on in your life. And I think that's a recognition of the fact that you can get into all of these details, but if you're not really zoomed out to, you know, what's going on in that person's life right then and this specific topic, it's hard to get the full root cause resolution, right?
It really is. And I mean, functional medicine has a wonderful tool to do this. It's called the timeline. You know, you start mapping it on the timeline, and you start to map when they had their physical symptoms, but then you also map, you know, what happened to them traumatically, right? This is when they got divorced, or this is when their parents got divorced, or this is when, you know, there's just so many things. And the timeline does a really nice job of that. But the first thing is you have to ask. Now, it doesn't mean you don't do the testing and looking at sort of what are your nutrient deficiencies, what does your microbiome look like? All those things can be very important. But if you focus solely on that, they may get better for a while, but they're going to get sick again because that's one of the root causes that we do have to address. And I think they come to you they're waiting to talk about it. All you have to do is ask. And the timeline tool is a really nice sort of tool that you can use and puts it in context when you ask about these things.
Beautiful. All right. Well, I've got one, and I want both of you to answer this because I know this is a hot topic, but psychedelic therapy. I mean, it can't be overstated just how effective, you know, ketamine and MDMA and even psilocybin is in some of the outcomes with PTSD and other things. What role do you see this in the reinvention of mental health? And I'd love to also, from your perspective, Jeff, see how you feel like it meshes with this functional medicine sort of ecosystem.
Well, I'll just give just a couple of minutes of thought. I was absolutely amazed, almost flummoxed, when I read this month's issue of the AARP journal, bulletin, newsletter, whatever it is, whatever it comes out to the AARP members, of which I'm a member. And I find it interesting to follow it because it's kind of a social zeitgeist as to, you know, what filters down into ultimately kind of the public from basic science and medicine. And here was an article in this month's issue on behavioral epigenetics related to psychedelics in older age people, because it turns out that the greatest influence that these psychedelics seem to have on PTSD and other emotional mental dysfunctions is on people who have collected more garbage along the road of life, right? So older age people generally have a greater response. And maybe it's because they are the ones that are most in need of enlightenment. I don't know. There could be probably a lot of different reasons. But to have the ARP talking about the therapeutic value of this in the ever increasing number of our population, baby boomers that are now 65 years of age and older, and the degree of depression and traumatic emotional blocks and sleep disturbances and the restoration effects that these have, it truly is revolutionary when I think of Timothy Leary and my life in the 60s in the United States. So and the fact that the first two people to study the effect of LSD in mental illness were Humphrey Osmond and Abram Hoffer, in which they developed the HOD test, the Hoffer-Osmond diagnostic test. It's still used in psychiatric medicine today. So old things in new ways we're learning.
Yeah, full circle for you on that one, for sure. Helen, what do you think about this? I know you're right in the middle of it there in Silicon Valley. I know there's a ton of money going into those areas as well now.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
I mean, there is, I did a bit of a deep dive into this just from the whole business perspective and what this is looking like now. There is a ton of money being poured into this. And I think the reason is because it's so promising. I mean, it is showing such, dramatically good results. And, I definitely, need to put context around it. We're still learning a lot about it. It's not always this magic bullet. That the ones where we're getting amazing results are done in a safe environment, right? They're done with a good therapist that's there, that's supervising. Because if someone has a lot of, as you said, this garbage that they've collected for many years, it can be a bit scary and overwhelming if they start to come up. So I think it's showing enormous promise. I think that the investment should continue, but also really know that it's a therapeutic tool that needs to be done appropriately. I mean, they call it the medicine of the gods, right?
Yeah. Dr. Brown, I'd just love to get your thought on one last idea that I've had is that, I see that the first layer of MAPS testing has like 2 therapists, and it's a long term, and it's very like labor intensive, and it's very expensive, but we want to get the best results, so we're putting all the energy into making sure that it's the best results. And then over time, you sort of take some of that away and you see what you really need, and then it kind of becomes for everyone. I couldn't help but seeing the parallel with like functional medicine 101, long intakes, all the testing, all the labs, only to be then like scaled out with functional medicine groups or virtual groups or otherwise, where you realize what's really important. You strip away, the things that were critical to get us there. But when it scales out to everyone, it looks very different than it looked at the beginning.
Well, James, for me, I think often functional medicine is misunderstood. It's thought of as a therapy. It's not a therapy. It's a way of thinking.
Exactly.
What we do is we teach people how to think in broader ways, to use more data, more input information, more ways of connecting it deductively and inductively, things that are trained out of them in school, unfortunately. Having been a professor for many years and then coming back, 30 years later and seeing some of my greatest students, the ones I had the greatest hope for 30 years later, after their professional lives had gone on for decades, and the system squeezed out of them the life of their creativity and their inductive reasoning, because they just became automatons to specific standards of practice and kind of rote reasoning, which was really detrimental to why they even went to medical school in the first place. So I see functional medicine as not a therapeutic toolkit. It's a way of teaching people how to think about patient interaction.
That's a perfect place to finish. And I 100% agree. And it wasn't until like when I saw the timeline, the matrix and everything up there, I was like, okay, I see what this is now. And that was a transformational moment for me to really realize that here was a structure that could, teams could be built around, care could be delivered around, and sort of a unifying framework for the future of healthcare. So thank you for bringing us that. And Helen, thank you for being us here this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I'm very, very excited for the upcoming conference. But but I do have one thing that I want to share before we leave, which is that speaking of creativity, Doc, that like I can't help but keep my creative juices flowing. And one of the things that we're going to share is, all the sort of like sponsors that we have, throughout the functional forum. And in the last month, we've added Avexia Diagnostics, which is a sort of a way to use a combination of all the functional labs and conventional labs in an easy to use way. I think it's very much like full script for labs. But I'm super excited in that a project that I've been working on for the last year or so is called Heal Community. And in this particular topic of the reinvention of mental health, what we've been doing is essentially running virtual groups using the functional medicine operating system to partner with clinics that bill insurance and run these groups. And since our last functional forum that we did in Austin, we've got the first data from it. And it's absolutely staggering to see the mental health implications of one, solving isolation, right? Putting people in a group, re-socializing, I think is the word that you said earlier, Helen, re-socializing people as one part. Then the broad spectrum biopsychosocial intervention of learning about how to eat, finding the right things for you, going through the elimination diet, going through a journey of the timeline, learning about stress, understanding all those kind of things. The way I'm almost thinking about it today, as we were sitting here, people always are very excited about how long their intake is in functional medicine. I'm almost thinking that this is the 24-week intake, because ultimately in 24 weeks, you learn everything about yourself, you learn how to implement the bottom of the matrix, and you're now set to actually participate in the healthcare system as an autonomous person who doesn't really need it and can kind of make their way through in a way that maybe we all should have been taught in school. So that's something that we've been working on for the last year. And I'm super excited now to be bringing this to prime time, working with clinics all across the country who are interested, who are billing insurance, want to bring functional medicine to the masses, and are looking for ways to deliver this sort of lifestyle first root cause approach. So check out healcommunity.com. You'll be hearing a lot more about it, but the recent outcomes show that with anxiety, fatigue, and depression, the vast majority of people who have those issues when they go into this group don't have it at the end, and it helps a lot of physicians unwind these complex issues. So you'll be hearing more about that throughout the year. I'm very excited for next month. We're going to be doing a deep dive into depression. That's going to be August 3rd, same time, same place. Thank you so much, Dr. Jeffrey Bland, Dr. Helen Messier, Dr. Emeran Mayer. We'll be all together in person August 14th and 15th, if not before, in Chicago. So we'll see you there. Thank you so much for being part of it, and we'll see you next
Great to see you. Thank you.